is mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
Hello, friends. Welcome back to the show. So what if the system designed to save lives was actually getting in the way? What if bureaucracy and not biology was the deadliest variable? My guest today is not a physician. He's not a public health official. He's just a guy who got COVID, never fully recovered, and decided to go to war with apathy. Marc Elia is the chairman of Invivyd, a company trying to protect people the world forgot. The immunocompromised, the chronically ill, the high-risk folks still living like it's 2020 because they have no other choice. He's also a biotech investor who sees exactly how innovation gets strangled and dies on the vine by indecision and Wall Street apathy. This is not a conversation about politics, but it's about power and choice and the right to not be left behind just because your suffering does not move the needle on a stock chart. I'm Matthew Zachary. This is Out of Patience. Let's get started. So I think the theme of the show is that the 5 syllables of immunocompromised have kind of become a mainstream thing post-COVID, don't you think?
Well, I think COVID was probably the first time in a long time that all of us have felt some degree of immunocompromise, right? And if that had some measure of extending empathy to those people that are really dealing with profound liability, then I am glad, because that is a segment of our species and certainly America that is underrepresented and underserved in a lot of ways.
We've done a lot of shows in my past. I've been on the air for 20 years on the invisible illness and the "but you look great" conversations. You got some fun little jibes on that narrative?
You're going to put me on the spot for fun jibes? I mean, that is tough hosting. But I would say it is remarkable. I think only that what again I think we all learned over the last 5 years is just how many of these people are in our lives without us knowing. So it's another one of these aspects of daily life that we're not forced to think about, and therefore we just don't. So I don't think that's so fun, but what I do think is it's this extraordinary opportunity right in front of us if we can summon some measure of empathy and if we can learn from these last years to just do better, right? I mean, I think the human experience in toto is difficult and everyone's on a journey and we can all appreciate that, but to go through life seemingly well but worried because you're deeply vulnerable, I think must be an incredibly uncomfortable thing. So I think I'm just happy again that there's a little more illumination and I hope a little more empathy that comes out of all of this.
Yeah, there's that word again, empathy. I don't think it means what you think it means. Right? Princess Bride. It's like, have you met our species? We're not very empathetic in many cases unless you're already in the club that you never wanted to join, right?
I think that's probably very well said, right? We're about 98.5% genetically concordant with chimps, and I think it shows, right? But, I think that is the distinction we must draw between ourselves and then our best selves. And if we can all, as I think many of us do, wake up in the morning and try to find that best self, empathy is one of the first places you can go look, and I agree. It doesn't happen a lot, and I was glancing over some of the questions or topics you were thinking about chatting about, and it did occur to me something that I think I've spent 20 years watching, which is that decision makers, capital markets participants, the people who kind of move our society at the structural level, do have very commonly the central distinguishing feature of being well, young-ish, not feeling particularly at risk. And I think that also shows in how we have structured ourselves in our society, right? So I think, unfortunately, empathy is going to be required a little more in some of those corridors of power because it's not just good policy and it's not just potentially a good business, but it's also just good humaning, if such a thing can be said to exist.
Right. And I was diagnosed 30 years ago, back when everything, you'll be fine. Get on with your life. You're lucky to be alive. Walk it off. Right.
Didn't you have brain cancer?
I had brain cancer 30 years ago.
And you said you'll be fine?
Yeah, they're like, you're going to die of something else. That was kind of like that was empathy in 1998, pretty much.
Well, It's never really changed, right? I mean, I was fortunate earlier in my career to be around a success story in medicine and at the time in the stock market. This company generated a drug now called ibrutinib. And its first approval, it's a transformational B-cell malignancy drug. Its first approval, I think, was in either mantle cell lymphoma or chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And a lot of the Wall Street analysts at the time were moved to observe that they worried that the drug wouldn't be financially successful because, CLL is not a very serious cancer. And you sort of read that and you think, okay, I imagine you've never sat across the desk or a room from a person in a white coat explaining to you that you have cancer. Because I doubt the first thought is, well, tell me where I sit on the spectrum of seriousness, right? Like I cannot imagine not being moved to try to extinguish such a thing. But again, it just goes back to that central theme of empathy and how we deal with and sort of extend the courtesy of that empathy to one another. It's fascinating.
I mean, I don't know how far down the rabbit hole you want to go on the profit margins and the necessities of the American business healthcare system. But, one of my favorite, I did all my spelunking on you, and one of your quotes is like, bureaucracy is killing people. But that isn't it everywhere? But in healthcare, it's especially literally killing people. But how do you conflate bureaucracy with profit margins?
Well, okay. So that's a pretty nuanced and timely question, right? Because for a lot of years, I think it's been relatively popular in political circles to kind of beat up on pharmaceutical companies. And I think, frankly, for a long time there, pharmaceutical companies did themselves no favors, right? There was a whole category of strict profiteers that didn't particularly innovate, and they availed themselves of price raises and so forth. And I think the bad actors in the industry over time justifiably earned their contempt from the rest of us. But I think in a more contemporary setting, this whole concept of health cost inflation is really interesting because drugs are, of course, one of the only pieces they're the only piece of the mainstream medical complex that reliably goes generic, right? So you can actually look at drugs in toto and think, well, gosh, for the relatively small portion of the healthcare spending ecosystem that they represent, they also have this lovely feature of ultimately, becoming common, low cost, easily accessible at some rate. And we may not all be happy with the rate on either side, but it does happen. Now, as it goes to bureaucracy, look, the reason most new drug investment is a tough business is because so much stuff doesn't work, period. And investors can think about that and try to rationally allocate capital. Companies think about that and try to rationally make programs that they believe in. But there is this kind of category where you get to, I don't know, does it almost work? Or is it undescribed perfectly but highly plausible? And therefore, I think industry and regulators have been trying to work on expedited pathways for some of these agents. And some of these things are in the news, right? You undoubtedly know about accelerated approvals, and you know about breakthrough therapy designations, all this. And really, in the end, what they're trying to express, I think, is that time is money and barriers are money. The longer something takes, the harder it is to get, even if it's a great idea, even if there's great data around it. The problem isn't the companies. The problem is that the companies, of course, have to turn around and get the capital to invent and do these things from people who are asking themselves difficult questions like, should I put a marginal dollar to work behind, some promising new B-cell lymphoma drug that, everyone seems to think it's great, but it's 8 years away? Or should I enjoy this new flatulence-themed meme coin that just launched 3 weeks ago, and it's already up 400%, and off we go, right? So, there are these sort of like unavoidable and unfortunate wrinkles to capitalism that I think, we can all bemoan, but the grand product at the end is this incredible suite of innovation and options for patients. I just think when in doubt, I think people who are insulated from the effects of their choices near term, and I'm thinking about both companies and regulators, should probably strive where possible to offer choice. I don't know that there's an established criterion in the federal statute somewhere that says, well, such and such an efficacy out of this vaccine is, quote, adequate, unquote. It was simply cited. And that's choiceful, right? There's a judgment call in there. And I suppose that the quote you're talking about was really about coming back full circle, this upset I think I have, at least personally, about the role of centralized paternalism in choices for people. I don't like it, right? And as a patient myself, I'd rather that I was given the information that is relevant to my decision-making in concert with my HCP and then offered a choice. And so maybe you could argue that the language was a little aggressive, but as I'm sure you know, when you perceive at some level that your life is on the line, a little aggression may be helpful, right? Might jar some brain cells loose somewhere in a way that you can't really predict or create otherwise. So I certainly don't regret writing it, and I certainly still think it. So let's see, right? Let's see. There's a very new tenor and spirit in the leadership group at FDA now, and I'll be very interested to see kind of how they approach some of these issues.
I'm still stuck on flatulence-themed meme coin.
You didn't see that thing, Fart Coin? It was like a big deal in like December and January or something. I might be getting the date wrong.
Dude, when we launch our band, that's our name, first and foremost.
All right, I have no musical talent whatsoever, but I'm already in.
Do you play the radio? But sorry, I had to go for it. I'm dad jokes. I'm stuck on the word adequate because, we have to come up with these terms that have to live and breathe in the ether. They called my brain tumor elegant oh, great, it's elegant. Is it going to kill me? Right. So words kind of matter, but words have to be a little bureaucratic per se. Mm-hmm. But if that was told to me, I'd be really offended. I would have been more upset than bureaucracy. I would have been like just epithetting deleted everywhere across the internet.
Sure it didn't happen in the drafting process, right? But there's also, thank God, an editorial process whereby the final product comes out a little different.
Yeah.
But look, I think if we also were to extend our empathy in the other direction, there are a group of very talented people who have to pick those words, who have to draw those lines, right? We empower them as a part of our social contract to do that, and they're doing it for us, right? So I would say I have a lot of fundamental respect, truly, and this is not blowing smoke, right? I have a huge amount of respect for people who get up and try to make those difficult decisions. The interesting thing is, I think at some intellectual and emotional level, the departure that sets mood is when you believe that it is being done in a fashion that's subordinated to kind of an oddball philosophy. Yeah. And let me just to expand on that for half a second. So.
Time's up.
By the way, that was very good. So the point is, in the last administration, the then commissioner of the FDA, Rob Califf, wrote, a farewell memo and talked about in an interview with Stat his tenure and said, well, he wouldn't really ever get involved in drug reviews. And I think, and I'm going to butcher the language, so I apologize. It won't be verbatim. But he said, in effect, unless a reviewer was insane or malfeasant, the American public would simply get the result of the process, and he as commissioner would take no role. Now, you fast forward, 9 months, 8 months since that election, and you have a new HHS, a new FDA, and an FDA commissioner who is working on initiatives like a commissioner's voucher for national priorities. And I thought, oh, that's very interesting, because you can approach the managerial and the regulatory problem either way. And I don't know. None of us know what the result will be of this new corpus as assembled, but I have to admit, a little bit of me appreciates the idea that when we put in leadership, they lead, right? That there's a vision and an ethos that goes beyond, you know what? The entity and its nameless facelessness is working just fine, thank you, and you can direct all of your gripes to the circular file, right? This is sort of there's certainly at least the makings of a new philosophical approach, and I think that's overdue, because the reality of the world is this. Most of what we hope to get when we go visit a physician is a safe and effective medicine, right? For whatever condition we might be dealing with. And FDA doesn't have the remit to guarantee the well-being of the American public. They actually provide assurance of the safety and efficacy of our medicines. HHS, above FDA, of course, has responsibility for the health and well-being of the American public. And I think what we're starting to see is some directivity of, hey, FDA and hey, industry, these are the directions we want to go for the benefit of the American public. And look, I think as a student of history and of the obscure history of the FDA itself, I think this is an overdue time. And so I'm hopeful, actually, that the bureaucracy, such as it is actually in the process of being animated and given some direction. And we can debate that direction and we'll find out what it all is, but at least it's being done, it looks like, so far in the open, which I think is great.
I want to focus on a word that you used, not the flatulence word, although I'm still perseverating on the band name. Choice. When can patients have choice? When do they not even realize they could have a choice? And who is preventing that choice from existing? It's kind of an existential question at this point. We deal with this in oncology all day, every day. Who helps you? I'll say it this way. Who is in the mall you're shopping in to guide you when you never wanted to shop in that mall?
Yeah, what a great question, right? I don't know the answer, of course. I don't know. Theoretically, we're all able to use all of this wonderful infrastructure, right? There's so many tens of thousands of brilliant, talented people out there who are meant to help and guide the patient journey. And I look at healthcare outcomes and I think, well, there may be a better way, but I'm not sure anyone's found it yet. And so I think we are muddling along in a lot of ways best we can. I don't think anyone can substitute the role of the individual, right? So the best doctors I've ever enjoyed interacting with are typically teachers, right? At core. They will happily share the benefit of their training, their wisdom, the options, and work with you as a patient to take you on a journey. But nobody can substitute for the reality that as a human being, when things get dicey, you have to live with the consequences of joint decision-making, right? And so I feel for anybody. I mean, again, I have some measure of experience and background and training in a lot of this stuff. And I'm sure it makes me a total nightmare with my, if I get like a sinus infection, I'm sure I'm the ENT's most annoying patient that day because we're going to have a lot of conceptual conversations about a lot of sort of off the topic microbial issues. But I think in the end, when we talk about choice and then we see how confusing and chaotic and almost overwhelming a lot of health world really is, I'm afraid there's nothing but elbow grease to put into it, right? You have God's gift that is Wikipedia and however many hours of the day and textbooks and friends and other physicians and so on. Like, I don't think there's a substitute for rolling up sleeves because some of the most insightful, thoughtful, well-informed people I've ever met on any number of medical and scientific topics are those people who have stared down that bad day on earth where they get some news or they get a test result and they think, oh God, this is it. And off they go. So I do like that in all of that mess, what the idea of choice implies, what choice means for a patient, I think is ultimately about power. It's about recovering some agency in this process to be an active participant in your own outcome. And in this case, since the outcome is you, that strikes me as appropriate. Now, I don't know that if you look across the long history of medicine, that's how it always was, right? I've only seen Civil War documentaries and Little House on the Prairie enough times to feel like when the doctor came around in 1880, the doctor was going to do whatever he was going to do, and you were going to bite down on a leather strap, and that was just happening, right? So obviously there's some measure of all of that expertise and application of care in a non-choiceful context here, right? Emergency medicine can run that way, trauma and so forth. But I don't think there's a substitute for individual learning. And at the end of your question, you talked about who makes the choice about whether the option is even there. I think that goes back to this complicated dance we have between industry, regulation, and what science and medicine can even unlock, right? So as soon as we see interesting targets in pharmaceuticals, they're instantly decorated with all kinds of different candidate drugs, and that's great, and it's healthy, and the innovative ecosystem goes to work and so forth. But at the end, this is a regulated industry. And so there is a role for the FDA, not in deciding what you and your doctor do. That is your and your doctor's decision. But they do play the major role in deciding what is in the medicine cabinet for your doctor. And I think as the world has become more information rich, as advocacy plays a bigger and bigger role, I think there's a justifiable moment to move in more of a fundamentally libertarian direction, right? Do you, again, I don't know your medical history, and I hope you don't know mine. I don't know how much you found online, but the point is, the idea here being, look, I like the idea of a central authority that makes sure that I know the best version of truth, that my doctor knows the best version of truth. But after that, if I, in concert with a physician, want to explore something, all things equal, I'd prefer the option, right? If it's a possibility.
Well, I'm thinking about all the stories I heard from people who said, if I only knew. And does that like haunt you at 3 a.m? All the people that if they only knew to ask this question, if they only knew what they didn't know they needed to ask.
Does it haunt me? I mean, it's like on the list, yeah, right? Because I think we're in this interesting time in which, look, in the broad arc of history, I think we're actually doing really well. It's the moment to moment, the day-to-day grind of trying to educate and trying to understand where it feels just impossible. But like, again, I won't presume to know how old you are, but I wasn't there for the dawn.
Now I need you to guess. It's the radio.
You're obviously
so no
31,
one's going to see.
but a very good-looking 31. So I think, not having been there for the beginning of air travel or the wheel or whatever, I don't know how many decades it took to sort of make people understand complex topics in more broad terms, to kind of get it. I think it was it may have been Bill Gates or someone else in the software industry who said people overestimate what they can do in a year and they underestimate what they can do in a decade. And I think there's a certain aspect of truth to that, right? Because like a lot of what you're talking about, or I think what you and I are sort of dancing around, is the chafe of how difficult it is to feel as though you know that certain solutions exist, that they could be, life-altering and so forth. But it takes time, and that time, that spending of time and human life and human treasure over the interim feels just interminable. But, if there's a flip side to that, maybe it's that in order to navigate that, you have to be pretty motivated, pretty focused, and pretty aggressive. And thank God there are people out there who are those things. And then we get better stuff, right? And better stuff very often is what can keep us on the right side of the grass, so that we can go away and try to do new things and complain about that, right? It's sort of a wonderful human cycle of perpetual dissatisfaction with the status quo. And, look, for me, I find it energizing and animating, but then again, I like complaining, so.
Above the grass is my dad's expression. Every day above the grass is a good day.
And he's right.
You alluded to one of my questions before, which is you must be a phenomenal patient when you go to see the doctors, when you know a whole lot more than them because you're a customer of your own. You are a customer of yourself. Have you ever encountered a situation where you're talking to the medical profession and they just don't get it at this point now?
You mean, for example, about COVID-19 or about anything?
Yeah. Like, how is this still a conversation is my question.
Yeah. Well, I've had those conversations. You do what you can, right? And, because I'm not a physician myself, right? I identify, I suppose, as a technologist, right? I like to invest in things. I like to understand and think about technology. Right now, I happen to be doing a lot of work in infectious disease. Great. But for example, I see a cardiologist because of some of the manifestations of my long COVID relate to palpitations and arrhythmia and all this other like lovely stuff that comes with the package. And my cardiologist is a great guy. I like him. I get the distinct impression that about 35 seconds in to something I'm going to say, he is now nodding politely and sort of thinking, okay, crazy guy. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to take this, and I kind of measure it by how animate his response is, right? Because if he goes, well, that's a great point. And now anyway, I know, you know what I mean? I know I'm being listened to, but I'm not being heard, right? And so look, I think this is why, by the way, I tend to get more interested in tool making than in lecturing, meaning changing minds. I don't even know if like door-to-door retail politics really works, right? If I go make an appointment with every cardiologist in a 5-mile radius and I spend hours with each of them, I don't know that they're really going to change their mind. I don't. But if I give them something new to do, a new toy, right? I think about it as like a new weapon in the war they're fighting against disease and death, which I do believe almost every physician, I think, is fundamentally well motivated and wants to win that war to the best of his or her ability. I think we talk a lot about all this stuff and to each other and wish that everything would be better. But I notice a lot of progress is operationalized by a new tool. So go back to that throwaway example of ibrutinib, right? Imbruvica, sorry, the B-cell drug. Could you have a debate with any number of Wall Street people about, well, is CLL, early CLL worth treating? Sure, you can have that debate and it's lovely and stocks may move around a little bit from time to time. But in the end, you put that medicine in the hands of people who can use it and the world changes and it never goes back. So I love science. I love history. I love medicine. I love all this stuff. It's great to talk about. But I have a funny feeling that somebody who was, 60 years old when the Wright brothers first flew probably never cared and never thought about it again. But once you board a Lockheed L-1011 on Eastern Airlines, and you get to Miami on time and it's a great experience and you got to smoke in the 13th row, you had a nice flight and your world has changed, right? So the tool makes for the progress and it makes the discussion more interesting. I think some of these discussions are useful mainly because they advance our ability to get to these new tools, right? And that's how the world changes.
Anyone under 25 is going to be like, what the hell is Eastern Airlines?
You said you were 31. I was just trying to calibrate the reference set.
And Michael Landon
I said you were 31. What's that?
You gave a Laura Ingalls reference before too, so you have a Little House on the Prairie reference.
I'm aggressively dating myself. Okay, that is should be very clear.
I will out myself. We are in the same census box. I did get a copy of your social security number. Just for the
did
record.
You? Okay, good.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Good. I hope you got it online from a reputable source, and it came with a checking account number.
If I were to put my finger on the pulse of the long COVID community, the movement, is there still like you guys are just still here and complaining, aren't you? Is there a rage? Is there an anger? What's the sentiment?
Do you think that's true? Okay, so I am the wrong person to ask about this only because there are so many better people to ask about this. But I can give you my version for what it's worth.
Please do.
I personally think that it is a real measure of anger. Okay, and I am surprised often at how chill still some of us are about the state of the world because. At least for me, and I have what I think anyone would call relatively mild long COVID. I mean, I have these autonomic cardiac involvement things, but here's the crazy thing is that most of the time, if I don't do anything, I'm fine. If I do something, right? Like, I don't know if this podcast, for example, would count as something. I'll find out tomorrow or tonight if this counts as a something. But then starting to do something to live as a human just wipes you out. Okay. So I think the things that would cause someone experiencing that, and let's be clear, there are millions of people experiencing way worse than that. I think being told or having it implied that such a phenomenon doesn't exist is rage-making. It's absolutely rage-making because there's this kind of overtone of like almost Munchausen-esque behavior, right? Oh, like you want attention. No, I want to play basketball with my kids. That's what I want. The last thing I want is attention, right? And I don't think I think that is a failure of empathy once again at the level of the people who would say such a thing. So look, I think this is going to be one of these situations in which we all find out over time that, it's an imperfect world and we're learning as we go. And I think clearly the people who are learning these lessons the fastest are those people who are personally impacted, right? So I happen to be one of them. Other people are them. What I think is wild is you see things like, for instance, recently the American Heart Association put out a quote scientific statement in which they described long COVID as effectively similar to other deconditioning situations, and you should work out, which is nuts. That is just bananas. But I have to believe that statement was rendered in good faith and reflects, actually, if you read it, it was pretty disappointing, and I hope they'll do better. But maybe it reflects some wishful thinking. Maybe it reflects just some misplaced research. I don't know. I think it's emblematic of a lot of the world that what makes you crazy is this seeming willful desire to not acknowledge or learn, And I don't know really where that's rooted, but I do think 5 years ago, we all went through this psychosocial trauma, and the population and individuals all kind of deal with it differently. I don't know.
My perspective on the pandemic as a cancer survivor who is immunocompromised, just even 30 years later, is the gift that keeps on giving, is that it brought out the best and worst of humanity. You had videos of people spitting on people, the whole mask stigma. We've moved on to an extent, and I think your comments are really spot on that, like, you never really quite move on, and there's always going to be judgments and stigma. Can you talk a bit about where the disinformation and misinformation may still exist for people in this community? Where are you seeing it? And are there leaders like yourself that are out there really debunking this, becoming like stringent voices of reason?
Man, I'm going to take that compliment and just sit for a second. You just called me a leader. That's awesome. So
you called me 31. So, we're even here.
What I see really isn't as much disinformation as kind of willful confirmation bias. And I'll give you a great example. I've noticed how, of course, like many people, how controversial COVID vaccination is, right? And when I sit back and think about it, I think I don't really know why. The data are actually quite clear, meaning there was a time 5 years ago in which no one had any immune experience against SARS-CoV-2. And then most, if not all of us, got vaccinated. Of course, there were issues, as there always are, because when you administer a vaccine, you're administering a tiny sort of simulation of an actual infection. So yes, it is very difficult to make an effective vaccine that is also inert. The premise isn't that it's inert or that it's got zero tolerability issues. The premise is that it's way better than an infection, right? Okay.
Yep.
So that can be true. And then simultaneously, what can also be true is that all these years later, with everybody immunologically experienced and imprinted by Wuhan lineage virus or vaccine, evasive variants are less susceptible to vaccination. Everyone has some baseline immunity. And there's a brilliant woman at CDC named Dr. Ruth Link-Gellis who presents a few times a year this idea of relative VE being at a much lower level and waning pretty quickly. And in fact, it's not like the information isn't there. It's not like it's not hidden. It's presented publicly. It's roundly discussed. But I think we have all these outlets, for talking to one another. I notice no one's invented like a new reading app or a new quiet study portal where you can, as a human being, not interact with other people and instead just read information and data. And so I think like where we're all suffering isn't that there's so much disinformation out there. It's that there's such a high ratio of opinions to underlying facts, right? Because I think actually there are answers available to a lot of what people pose as open questions. We just don't want to do the homework because the homework is like, it's either people find it boring or it's hard or you got to read these charts and you got to understand how the charts work and so on and so forth. So I think actually we're in a sort of a different spot where all of the information is out there. And I think we all can make good choices. The problem is we're dealing with something that in human terms is still brand new, right? 5 years ago, there were cars and phones and all this other stuff that I have a very smart phone that I'm terrible at using, right? I'm a moron with a smartphone. But the good news is I've had, what am I? I don't know what year. I think I got like an iPhone 2 and now I should be on whatever's new. I still have like a 13. But the point is I've had probably the better part of a decade to become just barely mediocre at using my iPhone. It does so many things I don't understand. But here we're talking about a novel virus that's pervasive, that swirls everywhere, that is surrounded by all this politics and sociopolitical stuff. So again, I'm hopeful because I think in the long run, we're going to end up doing okay here. I think it's not about disinformation. It's about how willing we are to sit quietly and learn before we talk about what we believe to be true. And I don't know how you solve that one.
Let me give you the Jerry Springer final thought here. So this show is listened to by a lot of industry influencers and a lot of Wall Street folks, tons of cancer patients and advocates. Do you have a core message that you'd like them to take away from this conversation? What do they need to hear from you? If they've never heard of you, if they don't know about Invivyd, they just learned your position statements on a lot of stuff, what is your core message to industry?
I think we're learning in some ways the hard way that human health is precious and finite. There's no such thing as a good infection. There's no such thing as a good cancer. There's no such thing as a day in which we can't all do a little bit better. And so I think the message I would have for all of us is to make sure we don't get overly complacent with how things are, because all we're creating is sort of the anecdotes for a generation from now about how bad they used to be, right? Our today will, I hope, someday just look unthinkably horrible to our grandkids, right? And I think what that translates into very practically is celebrating small steps and never forgetting to keep taking those small steps every day, whether that's, the regulatory discussion we had, the indifference toward, for example, COVID is over and so on and so forth, the dismissal. Rather than spending our time with those kinds of opinions, let's just keep getting back to work every day to make it a little better. We do it through tools. You're doing it through effectively media and influencing and knowledge sharing. I think that's all great. I wish for us all to keep taking those little steps, because one of these days they will add up to that much, much, much better world for all of our kids. We just can never stay satisfied with the status quo. And again, you heard it earlier. I didn't care for the use of the word adequate in a regulatory conversation. I guess it turns out I don't super care for the word adequate in hardly any domain. It can always be better. And part of the fun of being alive is trying to help it get better.
Marc Elia is my new favorite Gen X pop culture nerd and the chairman of the board at Invivyd. Thank you so much for coming on the show, my friend.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure talking to you. Thanks a lot.
Out of Patience with Matthew Zachary is a production of Matthew Zachary Worldwide. The executive producer is Matthew Zachary. It is mixed and edited by Kyle Moore. If you like the show, ratings and reviews are always welcome wherever you get your podcasts. If you have guest suggestions or would like to learn more about sponsorship opportunities, email podcast@matthewzachary.com. For more information about Matthew Zachary and Matthew Zachary Worldwide, visit matthewzachary.com.